All right, everybody, welcome to this project wrap-up webinar from Invest in Open Infrastructure. Today, we will be presenting the overview and findings from our project on investigating reasonable costs to achieve public access to federally funded research and scientific data. This was supported by an EAGER award from the National Science Foundation, and we are very grateful for that support. I will go over today our logistics. If you have a question, you can use my cat is very unhappy about that. Apologies. If you have a question, you can please use the Q&A function, which is in Zoom. You may have to go down to your bar and click the more with the three dots on it, but the Q&A option should be in there for you. If you have any trouble with that, you can also send it in the Zoom chat if you would like. If you would like to send a totally anonymous question, you can always message me, Lauren Collister, and I will ask your question for you. We will have time for a question and answer and discussion at the end. The slides for today are available at the link on the slide, and we will be sharing links in the chat throughout so that you can get clickable links to all the content that we're sharing, because we will be sharing a lot of links today, which we are really excited to do and to share with you all. Here's an outline for what we will go through today. We will go over the project, the overview, and the goals, and we'll share our publications and other outputs. We'll also talk about two specific sections of our research, the workflows research and our publishing profile and cost calculator, and then we'll share some of our project wrap-ups before Q&A. Before we get started with all that, I want to share a quick reminder of our ground rules and expectations. On the slide and in chat shortly, there will be a link to our code of conduct. And if you would like to ask any questions or make a report, the email addresses for Caitlin and Emmy are in the code of conduct link. Please go ahead and use those. So now I will turn it over to Catherine Skinner to give us an overview of the project's aims and goals. Catherine, take it away.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Lauren. So it's so great to have everybody here. First and foremost, thank you for making time for this and for your interest in this topic and in this research. I want to say we have published a summary blog post this morning where you're going to be able to also find more information and links, and we'll make sure that that link gets up in the chat as well. We can go ahead to the next slide. Amazing team. So I've gotten to PI 25 plus grants over the course of my career, which is a wonderful thing to have gotten to do. This is one of my favorite teams that I've gotten to work with. Just a really remarkable set of players coming from different perspectives and bringing different skill sets to the table. So huge thanks to all those who have been part of the project team. Note that there are also 27 institutions that are not on this list that we'll refer to later when we get to the workflows part of the project, who have been very deeply engaged in our project as well. Next slide. So where this project started. So if you rewind way back to a different era, it feels like, there was the Nelson memo in fall of 2022. And I remember when it first came out being shocked. I was not one of those that was in the know and had no idea that this was coming down. It's really exciting. And the five big Nelson elements, as we saw them then, and as I still see them now, were that for all federally funded research, you would no longer have embargoes or delays. You needed free, immediate access. It required all federal agencies to participate, so it was no longer restricted to just those with over $100 million in their budget line. Publication type expanded to include data and code and all other types of research outputs. PIDs were required at the time of deposit. That was really fun as somebody who has been playing in the PID space for a long time. And then finally, assistive technology needed to be able to work within the research results. So with those five big Nelson memo points being made, there was immediate uproar in the community from all sides and in all kinds of ways. And what we wanted to do was not participate particularly in the uproar, but really study why people were having the responses that they were, and especially what are the responses from an institutional standpoint? What are the responses from the researchers and the types of disciplinary structures that support them outside of their institution? And so the way that we structured this project included three main uh, pockets of work, if you will. The first section of the project was all about grounding our team with a landscape review. So we knew lots was already known about costs and price of publishing articles and data and doing so in immediately publicly accessible forms. And so we did a mix of both desk research and quantitative analysis to ultimately yield two white papers. We'll talk a little bit about that in just a couple of minutes. But our intent there was not to reinvent any wheels, but really to start with some succinct documentation that would make sure that we were on top of what was known at the time and could build from there. The second part of the project sought to understand how the work of different groups, including societies, data repositories, universities, and research institutions of all types, how are they going to be actually impacted by the Nelson memo and the new policy guidance, which was scheduled from the beginning to take effect in January of 2026? We conducted a set of surveys, interviews, focus groups, and did that with 10 repositories and ultimately with 25 research institutions who completed the whole process in order to map what their workflows look like currently and to understand how they were preparing for compliance with new policies following the Nelson memo. And in that part of our work, we were especially interested to identify any clear distinctions or any clear disadvantages that might be there based on either the type of institution or the tier of institution or the business form of the repository or the disciplinary focus of either a repository or a university. And we'll give you a lot of information about that in just a couple of minutes. It was a really wonderful part of the project and one that we hope will be able to actually keep going in several different ways. The third component of the project has been all around developing and delivering guidance documentation for institutions, especially research institutions, but also to the degree that, this is a shared problem space, societies, publishers, and consortia, where we're sharing what we've learned about the evolving spectrum of activity and how institutions, especially research institutions, are responding nationwide and where we see possible intervention and action points that might benefit them. Next slide. And there I'm going to hand off to the first of our presenters from the project team. For each of the sections of our work, I'm going to have one team member sharing out a synopsis of what we did. Lots of team members were involved in all of these. And I can't stress enough how much of a joint effort this project has been or how incredibly talented and thoughtful this team is. So Jennifer Kemp is going to share some of the deep dives that she and Gail Steinhardt led in really challenging territory, establishing what was known in roughly 2023 and 2024 about the costs and prices associated with either repositing data or publishing articles. And then Jennifer's going to hand off to Lauren Collister, who, together with Sarah Lippincott, led the work on the workflows and decision chains. And they will share deep results from that. They in turn will hand it back off to me, and I will channel Eric Shares, who has been a wonderful consultant on this project and couldn't join us today, but led most of the work on the publishing profiler and also helped a lot on the cost calculator. I'll tag in Cameron Nayland to share some stuff on the cost calculator work that we've done. And then I will wrap with some of our observations from the project. So over to you, Jennifer.
Thank you, Catherine. And I have to echo what she said about the team. I mean, this sort of project is the kind of thing that takes a village, and this was just a fantastic group to work with. So hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today. I'm going to take us through a few slides on, as Catherine said, a couple of the outputs from this project, looking at the landscape for repositories and data and for publications as they relate to costs. And of course, this is, meant to look at how we got to where we are now, or at least where we were over a year ago. So including the history that provides the context and the work that stretches back now a couple of decades that focuses on costs. So as you can see, excuse me, both of these reports are available on Zenodo, one of the repositories we talk about in that paper, along with all the other research outputs. So what we focused on here was what real world information is out there. What are the actual costs and prices? And I'll come back to those terms shortly, along with the business models and the stakeholders involved in them, and the degree to which they may or may not have changed over time. Next slide, please. So the first task was to define the terms involved. So these were set out in the first paper, the paper that focuses on data and repositories of various kinds. And it also includes the terms reasonable and allowable. But for the purposes of today's discussion, we'll look at cost and price. And first noting that these two did need to be two distinct concepts and definitions, since they're often used interchangeably. So first, cost refers to expenses incurred in providing public access to resources or outputs and their delivery and maintenance. These can be individual costs or grouped together into cost components. Price is what authors or their institutions pay to those that do the work of providing public access. So these definitions were expanded slightly in the second report on publications to include some of the diversity of stakeholders that you see here in italics. Next slide. So repositories that provide access to data are very varied as a group. There are, of course, multiple possible revenue sources, and that can include flat membership and deposit fees. Institutional repositories may be subsidized, and they may include sunk costs. So looking at costs for data also means asking who does the work of preparing or curating the data, along with how long it might need to be maintained. So as a group, scale is a big issue when it comes to cost and price. Data availability is very common in some disciplines, of course, but it's still improving overall. And revenue models, types of data, and maintenance all, of course, factor into the question of how sustainable scaling up would be for those that provide access to the data. Next slide. So text-based publications have a longer history than data, but although cost information does exist and is growing, the availability of that is still fairly recent. And what became clear very quickly in this project is that what is available is non-standard. What's provided is generally voluntary, and tracking payments in form of APCs, as many of you know, is notoriously difficult. There are a lot of good efforts on this, so I'll note the Journal Comparison Service from Coalition S, the Open Cost Project based out of Germany has a really useful schema for this information. And though business models have grown and varied quite a bit over the years, they still largely hold to familiar stakeholders and patterns. And the question of who pays for mandates such as a Nelson memo, obviously still an open question. That's part of what we're here to discuss today. So having regular standardized cost information across disciplines, which have considerable variety in price, is probably the biggest need in assessing what is reasonable, certainly at the system level. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Lauren.
Thank you, Jennifer. So with this background information in mind, we set out to do some interviews. So we wanted to talk to the folks who were actually working in this space to find out what was on their mind, what kind of efforts they were working on to understand cost and price for their services, and what were they seeing as the biggest factors contributing to cost and price. So we did first the repository interviews, which I will go over briefly, and then turn it over to Sarah for the institutional interviews. So when we did the repository interviews, we talked to the folks listed on the screen. So thank you to those of you from these organizations who provided your insights. And we did ask, have you tried to do any sort of cost breakdown? Did you try to understand, the relationship between your costs and the prices that you charge? What kinds of prices do you charge? How do you think about those as need increases or decreases for your services? And, we found out several things from our participating repositories, some of which are in the report, but some of which really informed most of this project going forward. So the findings from the repository interviews are that, in fact, most of them had tried at some point to estimate their costs, whether by upload, by data set, by hour of work, all kinds of different ways there. And they all reported it was extremely difficult. It was an important exercise, and they had interesting outcomes of that work, including a discovery of all the variables that go into the calculation, and in fact, the variability of what those costs might be for essentially what was the same kind of work. Overall, our repository colleagues reported that labor is actually the biggest cost, and that is human expertise. And that is in work such as curation, programming, development, advocacy, metadata, and that expertise is essential for so many aspects of the repository work, and support for the people doing that work is really key. We also heard that repositories see increase in demand as a potential strain, not only on their technical resources, do we have enough storage, do we have enough capacity to deliver this information or this data set on demand, do we have the correct software in place to do what we need to do with this, but also on the people power that is essential. People need to look at these things. They need to do the actual work of curation, advocacy, metadata, all these things. And adding more onto that means you need to add more people. And finally, we heard about funding models. We heard great interest in funding models that go beyond deposit fees. Deposit fees are a way to generate revenue that is analogous to other kinds of fees in this field that we might be familiar with. But other models like memberships, partnerships, dedicated funding from organizations that rely on the repositories, these are of great interest. I'll just share that we did present these findings in various places, so you can get slides and recordings of several of these as well. And now I will turn it over to Sarah to talk about our institutional research. Sarah, take it away.
Thanks very much, Lauren. I'm going to give an overview of our work with institutions to understand how they're responding to public access mandates, identifying the range of research support, infrastructure, administrative activities that are required to deliver on these policies. Next slide. We worked with 3 partnering consortia in the US, the Big Ten Academic Alliance, the Historically Black Colleges and Universities Library Alliance, and the Ivy Plus Consortium to recruit participants for the project. A total of 40 institutions expressed interest in participating, and 25 completed the full research process. Despite our best efforts, we found ourselves working with a more homogeneous cohort than we expected, almost exclusively doctoral universities, though they do represent a range of R&D expenditure levels. Unfortunately, we heard from potential partners in community colleges in particular that they just don't have the capacity to participate in a project like this right now with the institutional time commitment entailed because of the various pressures on them. And we regret not being able to share their perspectives here as well. Next slide. For each institution, we convened a cross-section of campus stakeholders, typically representatives from libraries, information technology, research offices, along with additional participants from other units involved in the process. So in some cases, representatives of high-performance computing centers or other units. Together, we mapped out the institution's workflow, then refined it through discussion to identify when and how considerations of open data, open publications, repositories, and other forms of research output sharing arose and how they were managed by the various units involved. We worked with our partners over a series of 2 meetings and asynchronous revisions to gather information and to visualize a typical workflow as a federally funded study moves from a preliminary idea to a project closeout. So here's what those look like at a bird's eye view. And next, please, Lauren. And this is what they look like a little bit closer up. Next slide, please. We found we could categorize activities into 11 overlapping buckets. We represented those in the workflows as 9 consecutive phases and 2 parallel processes that span multiple stages. In reality, of course, workflows rarely play out in that neat a fashion, with one discrete step leading to the next one and one stage leading to the next. More typically you see activities that may happen in parallel simultaneously, that processes that may move back and forth between these different workflow stages as we identified them. But this approach of visualizing them in this way made it easier to see groupings of activity where coordination needs to happen and the potential handoff points between units and projects as they move from proposal to closeout, to find gaps in where things may fall through the cracks, different points where a step might be disconnected from the next and it's not immediately clear how a project moves from point A to point B. And also the points at which different units and systems or infrastructure were most engaged. We could see that for example, libraries were often invoked a lot in those later phases of the project during data sharing, while research grants administration offices typically were more involved in those earlier activities. Next slide. Our research shows that many campuses are still very much in a wait and see mode on the Nelson Memo. Our workflow interviews, as well as a survey that we did with each of those campuses, found that our campuses there was still a lot of hesitation and not a lot of action on new policies, new infrastructure, new activities in support of public access mandates. Libraries in particular reported in our studies that the impacts of Nelson are noticeable or even transformational for them. But even within libraries, they also reported little change in practice, policy, technology implementation in response to the memo. At the same time, libraries and other units are also still reporting that they're often brought in at the last minute. They're scrambling to provide services and infrastructure that researchers need until very late in the game. We found that while technical infrastructure for public access is widely supported across our cohort, the institutional policies and support are still lagging behind, and that the compliance burden largely rests on individual investigators. We heard that almost across the board, that the responsibility for ensuring that public access requirements are met is with the PI. We found that funding to cover article costs is common across our cohort, but support for research data sharing costs is far less so. And finally, our workflows are relevant to ongoing conversations about indirect cost recovery and the proposed caps as well. They really demonstrate the breadth and level of support provided by research and information services like libraries and other campus units, and the recognition of these units as essential research infrastructure rather than administrative overhead. So one more nuanced approach to differentiating these costs is described in the article linked there, which you may find of interest. Next slide. You can read more about the results of our research in our publication Between the Memo and the Mandate, Institutional Perspectives on Public Access Readiness. We've also published all of the workflow visualizations that we created during this project with the permission of the participating institutions. You can find the link there. And our publication, Preparing for Public Access, Mapping Institutional Workflows for Sponsored Research Success, provides models and detailed guidance to help you visualize and refine your own local workflows and ideas on how to use your workflow to improve communication, advocacy, and practices in your local context. Our partners in this project reported that documenting their workflow produced immediate effects for them. It illuminated previously hidden gaps and inefficiencies, improved communication, it made connections, and fostered a sense of shared purpose and collaboration among staff across different units in the organization. Completing this process provides an opportunity for conversation and a visual aid that can help you discuss friction points and potential improvements, identify new interventions as the policy landscape changes, surface technical infrastructure needs, and raise internal awareness of current offerings, surface gaps, redundancies, missing connections, and communicate your activities and impact to your institutional leadership. We also found that it helped our participants understand and leverage their institution's organizational culture. It really revealed where institutions have a more centralized set of services and high levels of institutional control versus a more distributed approach and increased researcher autonomy. The workflow can help you kind of identify these kinds of patterns and adapt your approaches to working with researchers on federally sponsored research based on what works best in your context. So we hope you'll find our documentation useful in improving intramural coordination and public access outcomes at your institution as well. Thank you.
Super. And I'll pick back up there. But before I do, I just want to say again, a huge thank you to the institutions that spent so much time with us in order for us to do this ethnographic research. So it was 2 surveys for every campus that went to lots of different groups within that campus, at least 3 groups on every campus. The interviews included up to like 18 people in some of the institutional settings. So we really appreciated, and there were 2 interviews for each one. And then we grabbed everybody and pulled them together for learning sessions where they could learn from each other and see each other's workflows and talk through what they saw as similar, different, etc. It was just a really, really rich part of the project, and we couldn't have done it without a whole lot of energy and time that other institutions put into this. So again, huge thank you. Now, coming into the project, we knew that one of the perplexing challenges that every stakeholder involved in this kind of Nelson memo universe, the repositories, the researchers, the research institutions, the publishers, we knew that one of the things that was most front and center in their minds was predicting how this was going to impact their activities, including their bottom line. And the most straightforward of these stakeholder communities for us to study or assist was the research institutions. This was an eager grant. This is, we greatly appreciate the resources that NSF put into this grant, but it is a small grant, and there's only so far that we could move. So we really focused in on the research institutions for this piece. And we wanted to provide the universities, the labs, and the colleges that rely on federal funds and that would have new compliance challenges and requirements beginning in 2026 with whatever we could to help them better see how much of a change they might be looking at post-Nelson and what kinds of preparatory and migration strategies and things like that they needed to employ now in order to be ready for the future. So we approached that challenge with 2 builds. One is the Publishing Profiler, which is focused on revealing an institution's federally funded research output totals. So how many articles resulted from federal research investments for an institution, and then to visualize what percentage of those were currently open versus closed. So ultimately, what is your footprint? And then we did a prototype for a cost calculator that works to surface as much as possible about the real costs that institutions are accruing in APCs, read and publish agreements, transformative agreements, and through deep engagement with single institutions, we did that work. As a preface, before I go into these, let me say very clearly that these are building blocks, they are not products. The Eager Grant gave us the opportunity to design and pilot and test some really important approaches, and they're already being built on, which is really exciting too. We've laid solid groundwork, we think, through this project that others should be able to build on and refine and actualize these open tools in the future. And especially, at IOI, we're assessing where the community need and desire for these tools might be so that we can determine what role we might play in the future as well. Next slide. So with all that said, publishing profiler, and you can see all the institutions up in the top corner of the window. This is an interactive dashboard that helps to visualize characteristics about research publications from participating universities and research centers. And Eric Shares was our key consultant on this project, and he built on previous work that he had designed and completed using dimensions as his main data set to look at the publications of his own institution, Iowa State University, in 2022. He inspired us to take this to another level. And his work on this project began with testing. One of the things that we wanted to see is, instead of using dimensions, can we use open data sources for this? And so OpenAlex, which, as hopefully everyone here is aware, is an ever-growing open data set. We wanted him to try using that to conduct the analysis. And one of our white papers, which you can find in the list that Jerry keeps popping up on that site, one of our white papers gives a lot more details on our findings regarding different data set options and what information they can yield on this topic. The punchline in this context is that Dimensions has enriched its metadata in ways that are extremely useful for identifying when an article cites federal funding, which is why Eric used it in the first place. And Digital Science graciously permitted IOI to use Dimensions for the purpose of this project. So that is one of our data sources. But OpenAlex has its strengths too, of course. And one of those strengths is that it has really strong data about the corresponding author. And what we mean by corresponding author is, when you're publishing, especially in science and social science publishing, most articles are going to credit multiple authors who represent, in many cases, different research institutions. And we needed a way to identify which author and which institution was most likely to have been the lead PI and primary awardee for federal funding, in order to be able to tie an article to a single institution as a part of its publishing footprint. So there's a high likelihood that when you are the corresponding author, you are also the PI. And so we use that information, which came through most clearly in OpenAlex, to designate what institution a particular article basically belonged to in the context of this study. One other important thing to note, we chose to look at an 8-year period from 2016 to 2023 so that we could see both trends and context. And then using Dimensions and OpenAlex, we established dashboards, and I shouldn't say we, Eric established dashboards with us that show an institution's total published articles by year. And we then refined those results, culled them to show corresponding authored publications and US federally funded publications. And then we dug deeper into that subset of corresponding author and federally funded articles to show some crucial details in additional dashboards, including breakdowns by the publisher, breakdowns by the year, breakdowns by the title, by the funding agency, and finally by open access status. So the very, very simple version of what we were trying to accomplish here is that we wanted to be able to see what's your publishing footprint for an institution, what portion of that is representing federally funded outputs, and then what portion of those are currently open. And what that can tell an institution is how much more will need to be open from 2026 forward. Now, lots of things have happened since this project started that impact how much federal funding is landing and what that looks like from institution to institution. But that is still one of the base premises of this publishing profiler, is that we wanted people to be able to get a sense of, if this is generally my publishing footprint right now, this is what I'm publishing open of my federally funded publications, how much more is there? And this is just the articles, not the data. And so, being able to estimate and then really taking that forward for data, for code, for other things is what we were hoping to do. Next slide. So the data visualizations show first, and I'm doing this not live, but there is a link to the live pilot of this set of visualizations. What it shows for each institution is first summarized in an executive summary. So the total research output for Iowa State University here is 23,548 articles between 2016 and 2023. And in any single year, the average was around 3,000. But if you look just at 1 year, at 2023, there were 2,776 articles published, and then nearly half of those, 48%, had a corresponding author who was from Iowa State University. And then of that set, just over half, or 55%, acknowledged some form of US federal funding. And that means that 733 total articles were published in 2023 that we can identify based on current metadata that would have been subject to Nelson era policies around open. Next slide. So then we go into raw counts and percentages, and we look at the corresponding author. Those are shown here with yes in blue, no in red, and unknown, which is a big category, in gray. And then federal funding comes next in the visualization. So the corresponding author is over on the left-hand side of your screen. The federally funded research is on the right-hand side. And that's, again, from the acknowledgements field and from free text, Dimensions has distilled what can be known right now about what's federally funded. And the Nelson Memo makes us combine those two things. So what's federally funded and corresponding author is what's going to fall under that purview of Nelson. Again, just to say it clearly. Next slide. Oh, you're already there. Sorry. One back. There we go. Okay. So when you look at the legend here, what we're looking at is the results through the lenses of corresponding author and US federal funding at this point. So the set of publications that are implicated by the Nelson Memo are those that have yes answers to both of those questions. They're the ones in dark blue. Now, next slide. All right, so then lots more details. So this one's really fun. You can see by publisher, the changes happening over time. And these publishers, you can scroll down to get to all the different publishers. And one of the things that this allows is for you to see changes happening over time, and especially trends developing where your researchers are publishing. So you can see, for example, the trends in this time frame of growth in articles published by one fully gold open access publisher, Frontiers, which is a big jump in this particular image. Next slide. You can also see what journals your researchers are publishing in most, and that's, again, corresponding authors, US federally funded, and how much of the publishing is open access right now, and even what form of open access is it in. And then finally, as you see on this slide, we can show the breakdowns by funding agencies. So how much of Iowa State University's NSF funded research is published open access and in what journals. This kind of information is information that even like NSF needs that information. So it's not just institutionally relevant. It could be relevant in lots of different contexts. So you can imagine some concrete applications of this information by those that are involved in research. The library at Iowa State University might use this information to gauge how demand for its own institutional repository or data repositories might grow based on the percent of non-OA that are eventually going to have to comply with OA policies in the future. Or the research office might use this data to help researchers understand that they need to budget for APC charges or plan to publish in fully OA journals as part of their project plan. So again, the use value of this tool has changed a little due to the dramatic reductions that we see in federal funding today, and that we can expect in near future years for any single institution, including ISU. So the footprint is going to shrink. But institutions should still be able to use these visualizations and this data to estimate, based on their likely reduction by percent in federal funding, what their publishing footprint might look like in future years and what kinds of interventions they need to make in order to be able to comply with open access policies. So that's what we've got for the publishing profiler. I'm going to hand off now to Cameron Nalen, who with the Koki team worked with us very closely on the cost calculator and let him talk about some of the experimental work that we did on a prototype that was tested with Yale and Iowa State University. So Cameron.
Oh, even remember to press the unmute button. So yeah, thanks for the opportunity to talk about this work. I guess two acknowledgements. One, to echo the comment. It's been wonderful to work on this project. It's not so often, given we've been based in Perth, that you have a weekly project call at 9 p.m. that you actually look forward to. Sorry, Catherine, didn't mean to say. So it has been and also that this has been a real opportunity to build on a lot of incredible work that's been done by other groups as well. So we were really dependent on a lot of people who've done investigations into the costs of publishing, on some of the wonderful data sets that folks like Leanne Butler and the team from the Skolcom Lab have released, the Open APC folks, the ESAC initiative. Yeah, we wouldn't have been able to do this without it. And I'm hoping as we start to contribute back to that, we can empower more things to happen in the future. And I guess we had kind of two goals with this because we knew going in this was going to be hard. So the idea, everyone knows, it seems to be really, really difficult to figure out what we're paying. Certainly what it costs, but what we're paying. And we were trying to get a sort of sense of total cost of ownership of these things. So going in, we wanted to create a framework that would allow us to bring information together that we knew would be fragmentary, that we knew we'd have to make some decisions about heuristics and gut feel about how it was being pulled together, and do what we could do with it, and also to explore with institutions what that meant for them. And as you'll see, the part of the lesson here is it's not just hard work to build a thing that creates some numbers. It was really hard work for the institutions to work with us, because I don't think the folks at Yale or Iowa State expected us to come back quite so regularly and with so much detail and with so many questions about the details of their spreadsheets. And I also need to acknowledge, really, the majority of this work was done by my colleague, Dr. Carl Huang, who is not here because I'm in Bristol at the moment, so it's only 4 p.m, but he's in Perth and it's 11 o'clock at night. So what we tried to do was look at categories of expenditure, show a slightly different breakdown of this on the next slide, but output level expenditures, publisher level costs, contribution to services and systems, and internal costs. And the logic here was we wanted to split out these outgoing payments into disjunct categories so that the data was going to be messy, it was going to be complicated, but once we put things in a bucket, it was only in one bucket and we could read across and add all the numbers up and at least have some kind of estimate of what the totals were. And we tried really hard to do that. Any of you who've worked with publishing agreements will know exactly where the pain point here is. How you do, was that an article level cost or was that an agreement level cost, becomes a very complicated question. But in the design of the process, we ended up making choices about that, which was also kind of an interesting exercise in thinking about what that means about how you would take these things forward. So what we ended up with was output level costs. So this could include things like page charges and other things. It could in principle be applied to data, though there's some challenges there, of course. This is primarily APCs with the sort of imagination that in a perfect world, we'd have all the invoices, so we'd know exactly what was spent. So we imagined this perfect world knowing that wasn't going to agree. There's publisher level costs, which can include subscription, publish and read agreements, or other forms of agreement where the cost is an aggregate level. So here the level of analysis is kind of the agreement or usually a publisher. And then we also wanted to at least have buckets in which to put these other categories of things. So contributions to systems and services that aren't specifically tied to outputs. So this would include things like membership of archive. It could include membership of Open Library of Humanities. But it might also things like clocks or other kinds of services and infrastructures that are part of that total cost of the system. And then finally, again, a bucket, we didn't expect it to populate this, of some of the internal institutional costs so that we could start to support in the future, again, imagining a future where we had the data to do this, the question of, well, okay, maybe we can't afford to pay those APCs, or we don't want to pay those APCs. We want to focus on repository. What does that actually cost? What does that choice actually look like? So that's, again, we're not there yet by any means. I'm not showing you any details or any examples of this. What we actually built was a spreadsheet. So the output of this project and the process was to develop a spreadsheet with a series of tabs that we worked with Yale and Iowa State to populate, to check, to validate. So we had data coming from our systems about publishing, in same kind of information as publishing profiles. We had data where we were estimating what we thought the APC volume might look like and how that might play out. We were producing those lists of publications and then comparing them to what the university knew about in terms of its publications and in terms of what it knew about what it had paid in terms of APCs or in terms of agreements. And so again, we compared the sort of public information from things like ESAC or public contracts through with the internal information and all of the lovely differences and complications involved in the details of those differences. That generated a spreadsheet which the institution could then use. And to say this, I could show you a blank spreadsheet, but that won't tell you very much. And we're not, because this is internal information, that'll be difficult to work with. So on the next slide, just quickly, just want to show an example of the kind of workflow we had to go through to generate this. This is actually a subset of the information to try and estimate APCs. I won't go through it, just to say it's multi-step and complicated. And we're still doing estimates, and that's where we are. On the next slide, get to the sort of the observations and the points. There's a lot of interest in this. People want to know what they want to know what they're spending. They like the fact that it was a spreadsheet, that it was something that was familiar and easy to work with. But the costs and complexities are significant. And I think particularly the cost, again, on the institutional side to backfill information is a real challenge. And I think that's kind of really a strong part of the message here. So on the final slide for this section, these are all challenges people in the space know. The data's messy, it's complicated, it's coming from different places, it's inconsistent, it's partial, and it's being collected through manual processes that are changing over time. And all of this makes it really difficult. So backfilling it, lots of cleanup, lots of work. And so as long as institutional data isn't standardized, as long as we aren't collecting this up front, it's probably too costly in practice to do this in a backfill way, which is to say we need better institutional reporting and accounting. What I will just finally say is it's really interesting looking at the difference between the US situation, where institutions are very independent, very running their own systems. In Europe, there's more coherence, more standardization. It's a long way from perfect, but there are opportunities, I think, to learn in both ways about what systems could look like and what can be done with those. And I'll pass back to Catherine.
Thank you. All right, and I'm going to run through these last slides really quickly so that we can get to some question and answers. So our learnings and what's next. Next slide. Institutional cooperation is difficult. It's also powerful. So we know that different university units are often working in isolation on federal award compliance, and that leadership doesn't have good visibility into existing efforts. Having these groups come together, I cannot begin to describe the power that we saw and had not expected to see when suddenly the research office and the library and the data repository and IT and the health sciences IT all were sitting in the same room and exchanging information. There's no better way to start to both understand your workflows and also really start to cooperate across lines. Next slide. Early engagement prevents last minute crisis management. One of the things that, based on our limited purview with 25 institutions, that we can say right now is that researchers are going to be held to compliance standards that they're not ready for and that their institutions aren't ready to support. That's dangerous. And if they wait until the publication stage and the output stage to mend that, it's going to be really, really messy a couple of years from now. Next slide. Cost transparency is lacking on multiple fronts. We just covered that in the last section, so I'll leave it at that. Incomplete metadata, we need it better. Next. Labor costs are key, and they're often forgotten in grants. And that includes all of that human expertise and labor that's happening in some of the spaces that are going to be called on more right now, like institutional repositories, but also data repositories, who often don't have models, cost models, or revenue models that scale with use. So you can imagine for repositories that are suddenly going to have more of an influx of federally funded data and requests from their members to do something with that data, if they don't have scaling revenues, then they're being asked to do more for the same amount of money, which they're already asking for too little money. So labor costs are key. They're often forgotten in grants, and there are these big slices of missing money already that I think are going to become much more obvious as time goes forward. Next slide. And reasonable costs lacks clear definition or enforcement mechanisms. We see some of this right now with the RFI from NIH, which I very much encourage everyone to look at and hopefully respond to. I just popped that into the chat. Suffice it here to say that we have models like travel policies, where there are reasonable cost expectations set by OMB, by the Office of Management and Budget. Something like that would need to be in place if we're really going to call this, reasonable costs a part of the equation for how we're going to award money and allow budgets to be expended in the future. And I will stop there so that we at least have a few minutes for question and answer. And again, thank you, everyone.
Thank you to everybody presented on this project today. I hope you have been able to click at least into finding some of these resources, and you'll find them useful for your future explorations. But now we do have time for questions and answers, and please do put them in the Q&A function in Zoom, or just message them to me in chat if you're having trouble with that. And I will stop the recording so that we can go through the Q&A here without being recorded.